Gimel Sivan, Echad b'Sivan. Yesterday was the last day of the Yemei Tashlumim. Chag Shavuos. Yesterday was Shabbos Kodesh, and of course Shavuos was on Sunday. So if Shavuos is a week, it goes from Sunday to Shabbos. Pesach is 7 days, Sukkot is 8 days, and Shavuos is a day. We also have 2 days Shavuos, even though you don't really need 2 days Shavuos, because you don't want to separate. But in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, they had 7 days to bring the karbanos. That's why all of last week, including yesterday, we did not say Tachanun. We didn't say Tachanun because it's the Yemei Tashlumim. In times of the Beis HaMikdash, Yidden brought the karbanos. If they couldn't bring them on Shavuos itself, or they couldn't bring them the day immediately after Shavuos, they had a whole week to bring them. So the Rebbe, when he talked about this, so the Rebbe made this into one of his Yom Tovs. The Rebbe had this Yomim Tevim that no one knew about, the Rebbe Bashafen. Zayin Cheshvan was one, and of course Yud Beis Sivan was another. The Rebbe made Fabrengens Yud Beis Sivan, and the way the Rebbe sort of left us to believe, Shavuos continued for him until Yud Beis Sivan. To tell a story, I think the Rebbe even told a story, but to tell a story that the Friedrich Rebbe after Shavuos, a day or two after Shavuos, his secretary, Harav Yecheskel Chachafegin, as they called him, went into the Friedrich Rebbe to discuss business, financial things, askonis, whatever the Rebbe was busy with. And the Friedrich Rebbe's comment to him was, Ich bin noch nicht herab vom Berg. I haven't climbed off the mountain yet, and you're bothering me. Ich bin noch nicht herab. I haven't come off the mountain from Matan Torah, and you're bothering me already with Dvarim Gashmim. The Rebbe led us to believe that Tishrei lasted 2 weeks after Simchas Torah, 2 whole weeks. Simchas Torah is Chav Gimel Tishrei, and Tishrei has 30 days, until Zayin Cheshvan, and a whole week after Shavuos, till Yud Beis Sivan was a Hemshach of Matan Torah. And the Rebbe's chap, there's so many details, but one of the more, original details was that he didn't only translate the word Tashlumim from paying a debt, Comes Yom Tov, there's a mitzvah Sasei to bring 3 karbanos. Shalosh Pam Bashana, Yirah Kol Zechorchas, Bnei Adna Deshem, 3 times a year. There's a mitzvah of going up to the Beis HaMikdash. And even though Midei the Chi was only on the men, but the Pashtas, they went mishpachas, they went families, men, women, and children. And there was a special halacha of Linas Laila. You had to spend 1 night in Yerushalayim hotel. You didn't have to spend the whole Shavuos, the whole Pesach, the whole Sukkot in Yerushalayim. But when you brought your karbanos, you couldn't go home that day. You had to sleep a night. 1 night you had to sleep in Yerushalayim. There was sort of a kind of a kviyas to it. So Tashlum means to pay. If I didn't bring it on the right day, I bring it the next day or the day after. But the Rebbe added that Tashlumin is meloshein shleimus. If I already brought the korban, but the korban was not brought b'shleimus, so spiritually speaking, I can be mashlim, not only complete, but make whole and perfect. And I like to add the word peaceful. The korban which I have brought. And the Rebbe talked about it in the light of Matan Torah. Right? The Eibusha gives us the Torah, and we receive the Torah each year on Shavuos. Spiritually speaking, this happens again. And like it says in Tanya, each year it happens in a higher madrege. So the Rebbe presented it in such a way that until Yud Beis Sivan, not we still have a chance to be makabel the Torah. The Torah that we received, it could receive more fully, more wholly, more completely, more healthily, more thoroughly. So that was yesterday, Vimizak. That was the end of Yemei Tashlumim. Yesterday there was no shir, so I'm mentioning it this morning. And now begins the summer. And the Rebbe always on Shavuos spoke about a number of things. One of the things the Rebbe spoke about every Shavuos was Chitas, Chumash, Tilim, and Tanya. And of course we would add Anan Nena Basrei, the Inyan of Limud Rambam. Whether you learn 3 prakim a day, you learn 1 Perek a day. And if you cannot learn Rambam, you learn the Sefer HaMitzvahs. And the reason the Rebbe spoke about it on Shavuos was because Shavuos is connected to all 3 contributors to Chitas. Meisha Kibul Teira Misina, Meisha got Teira from the Eibishter on Shavuos, which is Teira, which is Chumash. And especially since there is an opinion in the Gemara that Moshe Rabbeinu was taken out of the river, the Nile, on Shavuos. But there's a machlokes if the year Moshe Rabbeinu was born was an Ibayar or not, to 2 others. According to the Shita that Moshe Rabbeinu's the year Moshe Rabbeinu was born, 2 others, he was born in the first Adar. So he was born Zayin Adar Rishon, you have the whole Adar Sheni, and the whole Nisan is already 2 months. And the Pasuk says Vatispane, she hid him for about 3 months, Kishleishes Chadoshim, approximately 3 months. So if he was born in Zayin Adarishan, he was taken out of the river the Nile, Beizir, as they state, Beizir, which is the birthday of the Rebbe Marash. But according to that Shita, that it was only one Adar, so 3 months from Zayin Adar is Vav Sivan. And of course, it says in the Chumash, Vatikra Shmoi Moshe Kimen Amayim Ishisiyu. Moshe Rabbeinu, the Gemara says, had 7 names. The name that the Chumash uses exclusively is Moshe. Moshe got the name Moshe from who? From Bas Parei, Basya Bas Parei. She named him Moshe Kimen Amayim Ishisiyu because she drew him out of the water. And we know that getting a name is a shleimus. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't have a bris. Moshe Rabbeinu was Neilad Mol. He was born with a bris. You have to assume that his parents were from a Yidden and they went to ask Arav. I mean, Amram was the Gadol Adoyer, and they knew you have to make a Tafas Dam bris, but they didn't name him Moshe. They named him Avigdor, or Tuvia, whatever the name, Mistame Tuvia. If they say Kitev, it's Tuvia. But the name Moshe, which is the only name by which the Chumash knows him, was given to him on Zvov Sivan, when Basya Bas Parei pulled him out of the river the Nile. And of course, when you give a person a name, you have the whole Chassidus on it, that when you give a person a name, even though that is their name be'etzem, right, the name of a person the Eibishter gives, because the name of the person has to do with the soul of the person, or with the relationship between the soul and the body, as it were. But when we name our child by that name, so the Rebbe brings always from the Arizal, that parents have a nevuah, parents have a nevuah ktana, a ruach hakodesh, to giving the name, which is why the Rebbe, as a rule, shied away from choosing names. When people used to ask the Rebbe, what should I name my child? The Rebbe would say, it says in Kitzvei Arizal, that parents are given the nevuah, how to name the child, and that the Rebbe suggested that the parents should choose the name. There were exceptions, of course, actually many exceptions, but this was the rule. That the Rebbe, so parents give a name. So the name you have from before, but when the parents give it, as they say in Yiddish, Zeirufen das Areis, they call it out. Like you have in Chumash, the Alter Rebbe brings it in Tanya, Perek Vayikra. Vayikra means to call. But Chassidus Taiches, Vayikra doesn't mean to call, it means to call out. Something that's already there, hidden, is brought forward, is revealed, is brought out when the name is used. And this is also true when you repeat a person's name. Which is why it says in Hilchos Sfarim that when a person faints, and you want to bring the neshama, I just learned the Maimed this Friday, and you want to bring the neshama back into the guf, you do it by calling them by their Hebrew name. Because the Hebrew name has to do with the neshama. And it has to do with the neshama, which is on a level which is completely higher than the guf. So that even when the life of that neshama, as it relates to that guf, is completely departed, because the person has fainted, when you whisper their name, you're calling back such a deep level of the neshama, a level of the neshama which is completely above the shaykhas to the guf, and you can sometimes be zeicha and call the neshama back out, and that the neshama should be mislabish again in a guf. So when you're giving somebody a name, and when you use that Hebrew name, you're literally calling out the neshama. So Moshe Rabbeinu had 7 names, and these were Shmaya, like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, Shmaya sheyikale b'lashon hakodesh, the name of Moshe Rabbeinu, like it says in Chumash and Bereshis, Hu Shmai, it was his name, meaning it revealed the muhus, the substance, the essence of Moshe Rabbeinu. But until the name is used, it's hidden. And when the name is used, you're revealing that potential, you're revealing that koyach, you're bringing out that possibility. So Moshe Rabbeinu's name, Moshe, which is the exclusive name by which the Chumash calls him, he got on Vav Sivan. So it's connected to the neshama of Moshe Rabbeinu, not just the fact that Moshe kibul Torah Sinai, but according to this shita that he was taken out of the river the Nile on Vav Sivan, this date is connected to the neshama of Moshe Rabbeinu. And of course we know the Chassidus, it's really Kabbalah, and it's brought to the Chassidus that Moshe Rabbeinu was from Elam HaMachshava. Moshe Rabbeinu came from a world of thought, which is why he was not able to speak. And it's a whole Pella, Misan Pella, Adam, when Moshe Rabbeinu B'chlal was able to talk. And to be the Eibishter's mouthpiece. Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm going to give you the ability to talk. Halai anoichi havaya. That from the Madrega of anoichi, Moshe Rabbeinu gets the ability to speak. And this is represented by the name Moshe. Because Moshe means, min amayim mishisiyu, I drew him out of the water. So it's explained in Kabbalah and it's developed in Chassidus. Mayim means alma de iskasia. Water means ein safe, higher than Atzilus, Kesed. And that's why Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama was above words, from the Madrega of Machshava. And When Basya Bas Pare said Vatikra Shmoi Moshe, she brought this koyach out of Moshe Rabbeinu, and with this koyach Moshe Rabbeinu got the Torah and he gave it to us. So Shavuos is connected to Moshe Rabbeinu in more than one way. So the Rebbe always spoke about Chumash, and Shavuos is the yard site of David HaMelech. So David HaMelech's name is Miris. All David compiled the Sefer Tehillim. The Tehillim is a contribution of 10 people, but most of the Sefer Tehillim is David HaMelech's own. And in addition, Moshe Rabbeinu was the Ma'asef, he was the Malakat, he collected the Tehillim, and he organized the Tehillim. The Tehillim is his. And on Shavuos, David HaMelech Batzeres Meis David. David HaMelech passed away on Shavuos. And the understanding is that he passed away on Zayin Sivan, the second day Shavuos. How do you have 2 days of Shavuos in time of the first Beis HaMikdash? There's more than one answer to that question. The simplest answer is that year, Nisan and Iyar both had 29 days. And Shavuos does not have a day in the month. Shavuos is 50 days after the second day of Pesach, or 50 days from the first day of Pesach. And so David, like it says in Kapitel Lamites, the first Perek that we say on the 7th day of each month is Hadieni Ad Hashem Kitzi. David HaMelech tells Hashem, tell me when is my end. Hadieni Hashem Kitzi Amidas Yama, I want to know when I'm going to pass away. And the Eibush told Moshe Rabbeinu, Ein L'Megal Le'Adam, the Eibush told David HaMelech, Ein L'Megal Le'Adam Itav L'Gav, a person is not told his end. So David HaMelech asked at least Hashem should tell him which day of the week, and the Eibush told him that it was going to be on Shabbos, and David HaMelech passed away on a Shabbos, which was Shavuos. And then of course Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, who is the father of Chassidus, and the Teresh Shebeksav of Chassidus is the Sefer Tanya Kadisha. And the Rebbe always would say that even though the Tanya was written in the Deir Shlishi, but it's just like before the Eibishter gave the Torah to Yidden. Yidden already learned Torah. Adam learned Torah, Neach learned Torah, and the Avis not only learned the Torah, they did the mitzvahs, and the Shvatim learned Torah. Me'elam, le'paska, yeshiva, me'avisena b'mitzrayim. Yidden and Mitzrayim never stopped learning Torah, even though the Torah was given later. So al derech zeh, you have Torah Chassidus before the Torah Shebeksav Chassidus is written by the Alter Rebbe. And the Baal Shem Tov also passed away on Shavuos. Baal Shem Tov's yahrzeit is the first day of Shavuos. Not the second day of Shavuos, the first day of Shavuos. And so B'meila, the Rebbe always spoke about Chitas, always. Chumash, Tehillim, and Tanya. Because Shavuos is connected to all three of the sources of the Chumash, Moshe Rabbeinu, Tehillim, David HaMelech, and Tanya, which is the Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, Chassidus Chabad. And of course, we all add the union of Limud Rambam, which is the Tachanun of our Rebbe, right? The Chitas is really a Tachanun of our Rebbe also. The Frierdiker Rebbe introduced it, but the Rebbe made it household. The Rebbe tzach stark in them gekocht. I heard from my father and from others, when you went into Yechidus as a Baruch, the Rebbe asked you if you learned Chitas. And if you didn't, the Rebbe would not give you any other Hira. And you went back in the next year, the Rebbe said, did you start learning Chitas? If you said yes, then he would give you other Hiras. If you didn't learn Chitas, okay, so now you start learning Chitas. Chitas was the first halacha by the Rebbe. When Bachrim, even Chassidische Bachrim, went into the Rebbe to Yechidus, the Rebbe asked him if there were nizir in the Shleisha Shiurim of Chumash, Tehillim, and Tanya. So Shavuos, there was always a sicha about Chitas. And of course, there was also, on Shavuos, always a sicha about Chinuch. First of all, because the whole union of Shavuos is Chinuch, because of B'neinu Erevim Ba'adeinu, as the Rebbe used to say the Lashon, that when the Medrash says, when the Eibishter wanted to give Yidden the Torah, he asked for an order, a guarantor, and they promised him the world. The Tzadikim and the Nevi'im and the Aveis Ha'elam and the Talmidei Chachamim, and the Eibishter says, nope, until we set our children, B'neinu Erevim Ba'adeinu. And of course, anybody with any seichel understands that when Yidden said, B'neinu Erevim Ba'adeinu, they were not just saying, we're giving you our children. We're committing to raise our children. In other words, in the B'neinu Erevim Ba'adeinu is included, Shira Males Esa'eni El HaHorem. I didn't teach the Rebbe's Kapitel here. We only have classes on Sunday, but I taught it online. And I taught it in Shul, in Empire Shtibel. And one of the Mishtatzim of the Shir is a big Machanech, and he couldn't get over it. It says in Medrash Yalkut Shemene, Shira Males, Shir Lam Males, Esa'eni El HaHorem, El HaHoirim. I turn my head, my eyes, to the mountains, El Hahoidim, to my parents. And the end of the pasuk, where the person says, I have no help, and I need the Eibishter, depends on what kind of parents you have. You understand? If the Hoidim are parents where they're supposed to be, then Me'ayin Yavayezi is not a question; it's a statement of fact that when my parents give me ayin. So then when your parents give you a chinuch, but the chinuch is menasaf l'chutz, the chinuch is only anichi Tanya's dika level. So the child got a chinuch, but he walks away from the chinuch saying, I don't have enough. And the teretz is, Ezrim Yem Hashem. But if Shir Amalis es ein el hoirim, that parents are machanech their children the way parents can and must and should, and we committed to it at Har Sinai, we committed to it thousands of years ago. So then Me'ayin Yavi Ezi is not a question, it's a statement of fact. From the ayin, from the bintele, from the deepest point that our parents invested in of, Yavi Ezi comes our help, and Ezrim Yem Hashem is not an answer to a question, it's an interpretation of a statement. Vos made Me'ayin Yavi Ezi, Ezrim Yem Havai Eitz Shmayim V'Oretz. And the meaning of the words Eitz Shmayim V'Oretz is a Mekendur in the Welt. You understand that our connection to Hashem is not only in Atzilus, but it's in Shamayim V'Oretz. In this world, we could serve the Eibishter. So that's the title of the Rebbe's capital of this year. Yaakov Shemeni, as Shir Lamales Eseini El Hahorim El Hahoirim. So the Eltonim, which is Dinyan Achinuch. So Shavuos, when we said to the Eibishter, us parents and now grandparents and great grandparents said to the Eibishter, this means that we committed ourselves to be Madech and to be Mechanech Ois Hodev and unsere Kinder as sein Yidden und ehrliche Yidden und chsidische Yidden and befeidish Yeshnei Amechad. We don't raise our children to be like everybody else. We raise them absolutely to be different. And somehow we figure out, we find the strength not to raise them different and embarrassed, but to raise them different and proud, to raise them different. And Yisrael, Azan Sheba Umes, Yidden have the necessary, correct, proper chutzpah, not to let the world dictate to them how they're supposed to look and how they're supposed to act and how they're supposed to think and how they're supposed to feel and what's supposed to make them feel good about themselves and so on. So the Rebbe always spoke about chinuch HaShavuos every year. But of course then there's the additional component of the fact that we're approaching the summer, and the Rebbe was beside himself. The Rebbe was so disturbed by the 10 and 11 week break. The Rebbe couldn't make sense out of it. The Rebbe could never come to terms with it. The Rebbe adopted it by introducing the idea of Gan Yisrael, like the Rebbe said, in Droisne that's a camp, in Evenike that's a yeshiva, outside it's a camp, and inside it's Temche Tmimim. But the Rebbe was deeply disturbed by the fact that children didn't learn Torah a whole summer. And it's only in America. I mean, this is only in America. Most other Western countries, maybe Canada also, they have a 3-week break in the summer. The truth of the matter is, if you'll add up, I think it's 270 days. A school year is 270 days. Tisha Yachei Leida, 207 days is the time of a pregnancy. I think officially a school year is something like that, 270 days. It's not that in other countries they learn more days, but they break up the breaks. So if you have 3 weeks in the winter and 3 weeks in the summer and 3 weeks at a different time, it's not like the children get less time off, but the children are never put in a position of complete prikasol, of completely throwing off a yoke. You must remember that in America, there's 300 million Americans. Let's say there's 30 million children. I think that's a pretty accurate number. Maybe I'm wrong. For 10 or 11 weeks, most of them have no schedule, no structure, and no supervision. The parents are both working, and in many cases full time. And parents cannot afford to, there are camps. But the camps are for Grace Hashirim. Remember, public school is free. You don't pay for chinuch in America. Not that public school is the best thing in the world, because chas v'shalom, Shema lekim leitaskiru leisham al picha, you're not allowed to mention the Eibishter's name. And we all know how the Rebbe feels about this fact that we're raising children, Nachman al-Aslan, on the Eibishter. Without the Eibishter, the Rebbe spoke when he spoke about the moment of silence. The Rebbe said if you'll do a statistical study, you will see as a matter of fact that the rate of violent crime in America has gone up since they took the Eibishter out of the public schools. That's what the Rebbe said publicly at a Fabrengi. So it's not that the Rebbe loves the public. At least they're in school, there's somebody watching them. And when you have children and you leave them frei, they get into trouble, not even wanting to get into trouble. Or they throw off every yoke. They throw off every responsibility. And they even throw off the basic enuncius, basic human self-respect, the idea that we are created b'tzelem Elokim, in the image of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And push it for self-respect, for no reason other than self-respect. There's a certain tzoyim, there's a certain fence, there's a certain containment in how the human being behaves. And when you give children all this time off with no structure, no supervision, What do you want from the children? And the Rebbe would lament this till his kishkish came out. And of course, Lubavitch makes camps. And they attract many Jewish children from all over America who a whole year go to public school. In the summer they go to Gan Yisrael. And for many of these children, this is the Yiddishkeit for their life. But remember, for every Jewish child, there's how many Goyish children? 20, 30, 40, 50, 100? And the Rebbe really, really protested the 10 or 11 week summer. And this is one of the themes of Chag HaShavuos. I'm not going to say that he spoke about this every year. The first thing, Chinuch, he spoke about every year. No doubt about it. But the second thing he spoke about quite often in my years in yeshiva. I mean, I remember the Rebbe, every Shavuos, the Rebbe, during the Farbrengen, would raise this issue. That Bechlal people need to have fences, need to have Yiras Shamayim, you know. When the Rebbe made the Tzivos Hashem, how did he explain why he's making Tzivos Hashem? How did the Rebbe explain why he's making Tzivos Hashem? What did the Rebbe say? The Rebbe said he's making Tzivos Hashem because children lack Kabbalah Seil. Children lack the idea that when someone tells you to do something, if they're older and they're above you, you have to listen without Chavos, without asking why. The Rebbe didn't make it as a fun club. It's supposed to be a fun club, but the foundation of Tzivos Hashem is Tzius, folding. When the Rebbe spoke about the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach, so there's all kinds of names for the different movements that have sprung up lately in the last 35, 40 years since the Rebbe started talking about it. But what was the Rebbe's mishpat? What terminology did the Rebbe use when presenting to the world the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach? The answer is Ayin, Reyev, Heizen, Shemas. And sometimes the Rebbe would actually say the third part of the Mishnah as well. Every sikh and Sheva Mitzvahs. And I grew up listening to these sikhs. This is my golden ayorim. This is my yeshiva years. Ayin, Reyev, an eye that sees, Heizen, Shemas, and an ear that hears. And sometimes the Rebbe would say, everything that you do is recorded in a sefer. And Zeh Sefer Tel De Sodom, and when a person comes Lamaila, he's not going to have his drinking buddies or his club of exclusive members. He's going to meet the Eibishter alone, and the Eibishter is going to say, Ata, Osid, Lita, Din V'cheshben. What did you do with your life? Like the famous story with Alter Rebbe, that he told a Goy, an Eina Yehudi, a Goy, that the meaning of Ayeka is, when Hashem told Vayemel Adam Ayeka, Hu gefinstazach, where are you? So the Alter Rebbe explained to him that you have lived this many years, and this many months, and this many weeks, and this many days. And the Eibishter asks each one of us, where are we holding in fulfilling the purpose for which our neshama came into this world? The Rebbe made the campaign of Sheva Mitzvahs on the foundation of Yiras Shamayim. And this is incredibly sensitive and important for American youth. I've told this to you a number of times, and I find this idea very, very compelling. Reb Zalman Garadi Alav Shalom was the principal of the Lubavitch Yeshiva, of the younger grades in the beginning. Reb Zalman Garadi was a big chassid and a big lamdan, but he was a man of gvura. He was a very tough person. He wasn't a tender soul. He was a very strong. I'm not saying he was a bad person, but he was a very tough man, and he was the principal of the younger grades. And he asked the Frierdiker Rebbe many questions, and the Frierdiker Rebbe used to put his answers in writing, even though they were in the same building. And these, I have a whole collection, I have a whole file of these letters from the Frierdiker Rebbe to Zalman Garadi. They are, you could develop a whole curriculum of chinuch based on these 2-3 pages. I'll be happy to send them to you. Short little letters. But Zalman Garadi asks a question, the Frierdiker Rebbe answers him, and sometimes the Frierdiker Rebbe initiates. The Frierdiker Rebbe's involvement in the chinuch of the boys here in those early years, you could mamish build a whole philosophy of chinuch based on these few letters. And like I said, I have them someplace on my computer, I think. And I will be, if you ask me, send me a WhatsApp or an email, I'll send it to you. And one of the letters is where he asks the Frierdiker Rebbe about the boys playing ball. In Europe, playing ball was like a Vedezad. It was treif, chazer treif. But American boys shouldn't play ball. It's like not being American. So the story was that Zalman Garadi would catch the boys playing ball, handball on the side, which is where we're standing. This was the side of the building then. And he would take the balls, he would take a knife and cut them up. The Rebbetzin Chamadina went to the store and she bought a collection of balls. If she saw that the ball was confiscated, she threw them another one. And Zalman Garadi would come back and say, who's the millionaire who has all of these balls? He would confiscate the second ball. And she threw him this way, gave the one on. It's a true story. A lot of people told this to me. So he asked the Frierdiker Rebbe about the boys playing ball. The Frierdiker Rebbe said, you must let them play. It's America. The kids have to play. My grandfather, learned in Yemei Tashlumim. You're talking in the 20s and the 30s. And his whole life, his whole Yiddishkeit was, he called him Mr. Mendelovich. He didn't let him call him Rabbi. He made Terev Das. He was Adam Gadol. Mendelovich. And my grandfather told me that when he was in the Mesifte, so there was a boy in his class was got a good cup and you're talking now 1930s in America. The difference between us and them is so be'ein arech, and not in terms of erlichkeit, in terms of how we look at what it means to be a frum Jew. So there was one bacher, he helped him about Lenin, he would learn a lot. And when it came recess time, he went into the base of Medish and sat to learn. My grandfather had Shpilkis. My grandfather was a hot brand, a firebrand. I mean, he was not a stealing kaz. He was a lebedika kid. And one day, he figures, comes lunchtime, all the boys go outside to play. They played stickball on the sidewalk from a what are those things called? A manhole to a manhole. There was first base, there was home plate, and there was second base. We did it on Crown Street. They did stickball in Williamsburg on the sidewalks. And you needed a ball and a stick and a manhole. You had to run outside, and then you made a game, and the kids played. So my grandfather goes into the base and and 2 minutes into the recess, Mr. Mendelovich pokes his head in. Sterren, what's TSD do? What do you? I became a maspet. He said, "Guy, shoyna loise gas." He threw him out of the bit. Go outside. Alle mischen gas, no, always going mitten ball. All your demons come out in the playing ball. He was a real mechanic. He kicked him out. Alle mischen gas, go outside and play, get it all out, and come into the base medish as I mentioned. But the Rebbe said to the Rebbe Zalman Gadadi, you have to let them play ball, but they need monitoring. Now today they need monitoring. They shouldn't beat each other up. And they shouldn't bully each other bad. The kids can be so verbally abusive. What the Rebbe wrote then, 70, 80 years ago, was Shalayitzaku kailos mishunim. American children are very fry. And one of the symptoms is they scream like animals. And the Rebbe said they're not supposed to scream like that. It's feral. It's unbecoming of a human being. You're a person. In America, that kind of hispashtus is a rite of passage. The proof that I'm American, that I can be frei and wild. But that's not chinuch b'chlal. It's not even chinuch for a goyish child. It's certainly not chinuch for a Yiddish kind. There needs to be a matzah. A person has to have containment. And it's not like the psychologists will call it suppression and neurosis. It's called dignity. It's called self-control. It's called not every emotion I feel do I have to let out every time I feel it. Medav zayin mensch. Dav zayin mensch. And this is a part of chinuch, and this is one of the things that gets corroded when children go unsupervised. They become tzivildevit. At first it's just free fun, but it gets into their character. And this character is the opposite of a ben adam, and it's certainly the opposite of a Yid. So the Rebbe spoke every year on Shavuos about chinuch, no question about it. And often he lamented the summers and the kinder sein frei. Children need to have fun and need to be entertained, but children need to have discipline. They need to have order. They need to have control. It's negea benafsha mamish. Anyway, I just wasted a half an hour. You came here to learn Tanya, not to hear about Shavuos. But last Sunday there was no class. You understand? Last Sunday was Shavuos. And yesterday was Yud Sivan, was the end of Yemei Tashlumim. Decide how you wish. Either I stole it from you or I gave it to you. But now we're going to learn Tanya. Okay, 2 weeks ago when we learned the Tanya last, I made a proposal and had a chalukei deis. I made everybody happy. By wasting a half an hour on this introduction, I made everybody happy. I didn't think it was wasted. I just hope you feel that way. We learned a whole half a Perek last week, a whole half a Perek in 2 weeks. And we finished it. And I proposed to repeat the ganze Ma'aseh Nachamon. Why? For the simple reason that we learned it so quickly. Okay? So we had chalukei deis. Everybody said we should review what the shaila was, a whole class or a half a class. So now the whole class is a half. So and by the way, I didn't plan this. Don't think I'm that oizgerechend. I'm not that sinister. But we're holding Perek Chaf Aleph. This is our fourth class on Perek Chaf, I'm going to tell you what's going on, and we're going to relearn it from the beginning. The Alter Rebbe is talking about Achdus Hashem. And Achdus Hashem doesn't only mean there's one God. Achdus Hashem means that the world is not separated from God. That's what Achdus Hashem means. That the world is not separated from the Eibishter. That's what Achdus Hashem means. That the world is not separated from the Eibishter. And in this there's a lot of madregas. The highest madrega of Achdus Hashem is what we call Ein Eid Milvade. And here in this Tanya, the Alter Rebbe calls it Ani Havaya Leisha Nisi. When the Eibishter created the world, he did not change. And the principle that represents it is called Tzimtzum Shalei Kipshuta. And if you were here 2 weeks ago and 3 weeks ago, 2 classes ago and 3 classes ago, in the last class, you've heard me develop this idea with you. There's a classic concept in Kabbalah. The origin of that idea is the Arizal, called Tzimtzum. But there's a very, very important requisite that you have to appreciate, because without it you can't understand Tzimtzum. And that requisite is called Mokai. No Mokai, no Tzimtzum, because Tzimtzum means to go away from a place. The Eibush doesn't have space. Hashem is above the whole union of Mokai and Zman. Right? It says in the Bar Mitzvah Maimed, on all the mothers for their little kids, Vosman and Mokai and Beidim Mechudoshim. Remember? Yeah, your kid doesn't remember, but you do, yeah? Vosman and Mokai and Beidim Mechudoshim. Time and space were both created, but the Eibush, there's no space. Before there could be a Tzimtzum Arisha, which could create a Mokai in which the Eibush created the world, there has to be Mokai. And from that space, the Eibishter evacuates himself. So the big question is the Tzimtzum Kipshutei or the Tzimtzum Shalei Kipshutei? That when the Eibishter evacuated that Mokim, does it mean that he's not in the Mokim? Or does it mean that he's still in the Mokim but we don't see him? And Chassidus, the Bechlal Chassidus, and especially Chassidus Chabad, has the most extreme shita. That it says in the Zehar, Lei Sasar Ponui Minei. There is no space where Hashem isn't. And there's 2 Chidushim. Chiddush number 1, that if there is going to be a inyan of asar, space, that by the Eibishter there isn't, so in as much as there's asar, leis paniminei, there is no space where the Eibishter is not. And therefore we hold that the Tzimtzum is Shalei Kipshut. Now our Tanya, this is by the way in the Chitas, right? If you're learning Chitas, we're holding now Perek Dal Shaliach Emunah. And in a number of days we'll get to Perek Zayin. And Perek Zayin, the Alter Rebbe introduces us to this whole machlekes about Tzimtzum Kipshutei and Tzimtzum Shalei Kipshutei. Here in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe doesn't call it Tzimtzum Kipshutei, he calls it Dibur Kipshut. The Eibishter created the world through words. And we understand the metaphor of speech, because when one speaks, he radiates the words from inside himself to outside himself. So the question is, before Hashem spoke, the world was one with him. After Hashem spoke, he radiated the words from inside of him to outside of him. Does that mean that where the world that Hashem spoke is, the Eibishter is not? And the answer is Dibur Shalei Kipshutei. Just like it's Tzimtzum Shalei Kipshutei, it's Dibur Shalei Kipshutei. The spoken words of creation, in quotes, didn't really occur. The world continues to be one with the Eibishter. This is what we learned. And now we're going to relearn it. I'm just learning it over Chagata Mashpia. Chabam Gelernt Wenig, but Chagata Mashpia is in the Melech. The Melech Tzibur used to say, everything you learn, you should learn 3 times. First you learn it to familiarize yourself. Then you learn it to understand it. And then you learn it to experience delight. And delight is spelled in 2 ways. T-H-E-L-I-G-H-T and D-E-L-I-G-H-T. The light and the delight. So let's learn. It's not going to take us long. Perek Chafal, V'hine. Midas HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the measure of the Eibishter, is Shalei Kemidas Basav Adam. It's different than the measure of a person. Now understand what he's trying to say. We all know that mibisari echazel lekah. That if you want to understand how a lakus operates, study how a person operates. Because nasa adam b'tzalmenu ked museinu, the Eibishter made us in His image. So whenever you read in Torah, these innumerable, these so many references to Hashem being like a person, it's because it's the correct mashal. The Eibishter created a supernal man, Adam ha'elyon, and in that image he created the Adam ha'tachton, and therefore when we describe Hashem as being a person, because He does things in a way which reflects us. So when you say Midas HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Shalei Kemidas Basav Adam, you mean even though Nasa Adam B'Tzalmenu Ked Moseinu, even though Mipsari Echzel Lekah, that when you discuss a lakus, you discuss him anthropomorphically, because a lakus so to speak, created first for an image for itself. And then in that image he created us. So by understanding us, we can understand Lakus. So when you understand human speech, you can begin to understand divine speech. And just like when a person speaks, the words he says separate from him. When the Eibishter created the world, the words that he spoke in creation separate from him. Nevertheless, even though we compare the Eibishter to us, we say the comparison is not perfect. It's not complete. It's true that we describe Hashem's creation as speech because it's similar to our speech. But it's only similar, and only similar in certain respects, and in some respects it's different. How is it different? When a person speaks, Hare, emphasis, the air, the amplification of the words that come from his mouth, who morgesh is felt, venida, and is seen, as a dove, as an entity unto itself, removed from its root, which is the neshama itself. In other words, before I speak, the words are inside of me. No one knows what I'm thinking. Once I speak, the words have radiated from inside of me to outside of me, and in a space where I am not. Those words fill the world, and other people can hear them and see them. But by Hashem, even though we describe the phenomenon of creation as an inyan of dibur, says the Rebbe, ein dibur, Hashem's speech, even after he speaks, is not moved, though imenu yizbarach chas v'shalom, separate from him, God forbid. We call it speech, and we call it speech to compare it to our speech. And we call it speech to compare it to our speech because when a person talks, the words he says are separate from him. But we say by the Eibishter, there's taka dibur, he speaks to create the world, but the dibur is shalei kipshutei. The words never separate from him b'yemes. Ki ein davar chutz mimenu. There's nothing outside of him. V'leis asar ponim inei. There is no space which is vacant from him. V'lachein, and therefore ein diburi yizbarach. The speech of Hashem is not the same. Ki dibureinu chas v'shalom is our speech. Even though it says in Maimonides Chasidus that just like Hashem's speech creates by a king, b'dvar melech shilton, his words create. Still there's a difference. And the difference is because when a king speaks, the words are now separate from him. And when the Eibishter speaks, the world which created from that speech that looks separate from him is not really separate from him. And he continues in the bracket, just as his thought is different than ours. Now, when it comes to thought, what's the difference? Exactly the opposite. Hashem's thought creates. Hashem's thought, it's a zayah. With one thought Hashem creates. Our thought can create nothing. The Eibishter's thought creates. So we understand the difference between his thought and our thought. As the Pasuk says, our thought is different than the Eibishter's thought. So the Rebbe says, it also says, my ways are different than your ways, and this goes on speech. That even though the human speech can create by a king, just like the divine speech creates, they're still different. How are they different? Because when we speak, the words are truly separated from where we are. And when the Eibishter speaks, the dibur is shalei kipshute, the words that he spoke to create are not truly separated from him. And I'm reading continuing. The fact that we call his speech, which means we're comparing him to us, we speak, and he speaks, says that there is an aspect where his speech is like ours, which is why we use this word altogether, that the speech of a person down here, it reveals to another, to a listener, what was hidden, concealed, and hidden in his thought, the same is true by Yalakus, that the emergence of the light which is Sevav Kalam, and the life which is Mamala Kalam, from him, Mehel of it being included within him and therefore hidden. El Hagile, to a revealed state which is, so to speak, outside of him. Livre Elam is to create the worlds. And give them life. So Nikri B'Shem Dib is called speech because he's making something that, at least in its own perception, is separated from him. We were created from him in such a way that the center of our being is not him. The center of our being is ourself, because he pushed us out of him. And the Rebbe continues and he says, which is the 10 utterances of the creation. And he continues and he says, this is not only true about the words that Hashem spoke to create the world, but it's further true. Sha'ar kol hateira nevi'im uksuvim, the whole Tanakh, all the prophecies that Hashem communicates to man and woman. She'isi one of us, which was reached by the vision of prophecy, is also called speech. Why is it called speech? Because it's exiting from being in a hidden state vis-a-vis the Eibishter himself to be in what we're calling a revealed state that the other, meaning the person, knows it. So it's compared to speech in the sense that it's reaching us. It's compared to speech in the sense that as far as we're concerned, we truly feel ourselves as separate from Him, but it's not the truth. V'harei emphasis. When you're talking about Hashem's speech and Hashem's thought that we just said, on the one hand, our thought and our speech is the mashal to explain His thought and His speech, but on the other hand, it's not the same. Because Hashem's spoken words and Hashem's thought, so to speak, may remain one with Him, with the ultimate of oneness, even after He spoke them and even after He thought them. So when I speak, I have two choices, right? To speak and not to speak. Before I speak, you don't know what I'm thinking. After I speak, I can't take my words back. Finished. They're out there. They're separated from me. I no longer have control. Find a pasuk in Sefer Pashas Ha'azinu. Machatzti v'ani erpa. There's a lot of touches with machatzti. And one of the machatzti means I send an arrow. A person holds an arrow on a bow and he pulls it back and he closes one eye and he takes aim. As long as he's holding the arrow, he can make the decision not to shoot. But once he lets go the arrow fly, that's it. Now the arrow is going to hit its mark and he has zero control. By the Eibishter Machatzti, he shoots the arrow, Vani Erpa. And if he wishes, he can draw the arrow back, right? He's not like us. So by our speech, the speech is separate from us. Hashem's speech, the speech is separate from us only in our perception. But if we would know what the Eibishter knows, we would know that the words are still one with Him. Miyuchades may remain one with Him, betachas hayichad derech mashal, but the ultimate of unity. Derech mashal, for example. What's the example to explain how His speech is different than ours? The words that we say before we say them. The words that Hashem is destined to, that a person is destined to speak, and the thoughts that a person is destined to think, when they're still in his mind, intellect, or in his heart, before he decided to think it, and before he decided to speak it. Show us, well, before I have thunk, and before I have spoken, these letters of thought, and these letters of speech, that the root is, they come from my brain. And they come before they're in, they come from my heart, my emotion. And before they come from my heart, they're in their root, in my brain. Top of page Chav Zayin now, Shehein, HaChochma, V'seichel, Shebemeach, V'chem, V'tshukah, Shebelev. Before I speak, I think. Before I think, I feel. Before I feel, I reason. In my seichel, the words that I'm later going to say and the thoughts that I'm later going to think are completely bottled. The Eibishter does two opposites. After He speaks, it's like us before we spoke. After He thinks, it's like us before we thought. Meaning, even though Hashem's speech is called speech because we created it, we exist, we feel separate from Him. But our separateness from Him is separateness shaloi kipshute. Dibur shaloi kipshute. Tzimtzum shaloi kipshute. Because ein milvade, or in the language of this Perek, ani avaya leishanisi. Hashem is the only thing that is. When Hashem creates the world, the pasuk says the only thing that is the Eibishter. So who are we? We're pieces of Him that are simply blinded to the truth of our own self-identity. And therefore we perceive ourselves as separate. And that's the pshat. Ein dibura kedibureinu, ein machshavteika machshavteinu. His speech is different than ours. His thought is different than ours, even though we compare the two. Because by Him, when He speaks and He makes something separate from Him, it's possible that He should make it separate from Him only from our perspective and not from His. We don't have that option. I can either speak or not speak, but I can't do both. The Eibusha does both. He speaks and he makes the world separate from him, but they're only separate legabe us and not legabe him. Let's just finish. Same is true in the Nimshal. I told you many times that in Tanya you never have the word Nimshal. There's a mashal and there's a mashal. The mashal is the example, and the mashal is what the example is example 4. Miuchades diburei u'machshavtei shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There remains a oneness between Hashem's speech and Hashem's thought. B'tachas hayichud, the ultimate of onenesses, b'mhusav etzmus Yisbarach Hu, the Eibishter himself. Gam achar, even after sheyotze diburi Yisbarach al ha'peil, that his words emerge into actualization. B'briyas ha'elam, is in creating the worlds. That k'mai shahaya, just as it was, that the speech of Hashem and the thought of Hashem was miyuchad imei kedim b'riyas ha'elam, was one with him before creation. They continue to be one with him after creation. This is called Simtzum Shaleiki Pshute. This is called Dibish Leiki Pshute. This is called Ein Eid Mulvade. This is called Yichudei Allah. This is called Achdus Hashem Al Derech HaChasidus. Questions or comments? Okay, so we're going to break now, and we'll learn Yem Yem. Okay.